I was going through my files recently and I found this 2-hour screen recording of me taking a final sketch for If Tigers Disappeared and taking it to the final illustration. So it's a spread, that's the title page, and If Tigers Disappeared is the final book in my nonfiction picture book series. It came out in 2022 and I did the art in 2021, and I'm super excited to be able to share it with you now. I'm going to walk you through how I illustrate, the choices I make, and some reflections on this picture book series now, a few years after it's been finished. This should be a pretty long video. The raw recording itself is over 2 hours. So grab yourself a glass of water and buckle in while I walk you through my illustration process. Today I'm going to walk you through the title page for If Tigers Disappeared. If Tigers Disappeared is the 5th book in the If Animal Disappeared nonfiction picture book series, written and illustrated by me. One of the things I had to really think about with this book is that I had another book set in a forest, and that's If Elephants Disappeared, which takes place in the Congo Basin. So it takes place in a lush green forest. And one of the things I wanted to do was distinctly make these books look different. I had chosen a warm green color palette for If Elephants Disappeared, and so for If Tigers Disappeared, I decided I would choose a cooler green color palette. This way the two books could both be set in a forest that is lush and full of animals, but look distinct visually. So one of the things I did early on in the beginning of this video was I reduced the opacity of the sketch layer, and I labeled the layers so that they have names like Rough 1 and Rough 2. And now I'm just going in and I am looking at the PDF of my sketches, and I'm going to be referencing the character designs for my main characters throughout. Simone is my main character and she's in all of my books, and then I always add an adult character and a child character who are local to the place I'm illustrating about. I'm also now on Rough 2, so the sketch layer is all Rough 1, and I'm now going in on Rough 2, and I'm just finalizing where I'm going to put some of the more detailed aspects of the illustration. So the faces of the characters, the hands of the characters, you can see that in my Rough 1 sketch, which is a final sketch that has been approved by my editor and publishing house. That sketch is still rough. And that roughness really works for the painterly aspect of the background. But when it comes to the faces, I want to have more detail. And then when it comes to the characters or like the area they're in or even the animals, I want there to be more detail. I'm making sure I have the map of where I want the hands to be, the face to be, the facial features to be, and this will allow me to paint them with greater detail coming up. So right now, I am just finessing the faces of my characters. When I refer to this as painting, I am painting. I am digitally painting in Photoshop. The program that I'm in right now is Photoshop, and that's how I did all of the books in this series. I used 2 different brushes. The entire thing is just done with 2 different Photoshop brushes. I have a rough brush, which is really similar to a thin brush. One's a rougher version, one's a thinner version. They're both incredibly similar to each other. The rougher version allows me to go in and have like much more painterly brush strokes. And then the one I'm using right now to do these final details is essentially the same brush, but tighter together. And it allows me to have more control. You can see that it looks more like a traditional brush, not big and fanned out. As I'm adding in all these little details to make sure that I have finessed the forms of the 3 main characters, I am going to soon move on to being able to then add in color. This is kind of my final step, that while even though I don't need this to be like approved, I still need to do it so that the art looks as good as I want it to be. So right now I've dropped down that opacity again. The reduced opacity allows me to work with what I already have, but almost as if it's like a lighter pencil. Now, what I'm doing right now is kind of boring, but I think this is really important to maintaining organized file systems. I am now going in and I am making as many layers as I think I need. I usually have a pretty rough estimate of what I'm going to need. For instance, in this one, I've already started making more layers underneath the roughs. The roughs will remain on top of the painting that I'm making at a reduced opacity so I can see through them. And I am going in and I am adding background layers, and then I'm renaming them so that I know which layers I should paint on. I always make sure that my people are in their own section, so that I can clearly figure out like how to move them in case I need to adjust something. But I usually work with like different background layers with the people on top of them. And then if there's like, for instance, in this one, there's a car, the car is going to have its own set of layers too. Now, I always turn over my Photoshop files to my publishing house too, because sometimes they have to make like adjustments, or they want certain little like details, leaves or something for another page, which is something I always talk about with my art directors. They don't do it like without my consent, but still I often turn over my Photoshop files, and I find that it is easier if I have everything labeled so that they know where things are and things don't get like toggled on and off. So my filing system is not just for me, it's also for other people who might be interacting with this Photoshop file. Okay, the moment you have all been waiting for, we are starting to drop in color. Now, I use a lot of reference. One of the things that's so wonderful about this book series is that I get to make books about different places all over the world. You know, if Polar Bears Disappeared was set in Nunavut, Canada, and if Tigers Disappeared is set in India, but being a children's book author and illustrator, I don't actually get to travel to all these places. So I do a lot of research, not only into the science as the author side. I obviously make sure these books are scientifically grounded and checked by experts in their field, but I also have to make sure that visually they look like the places that they're supposed to be. And I know that there are areas in which I am not going to get it 100% right because I didn't visit these places, which is why I just do the most amount of research I can. Part of that research is also just making sure I have some really good reference images, and I will drop in the colors of those reference images. One of the things I mentioned earlier is that while If Elephants Disappeared is much more of a warm green book, this book is much more cool green in their forestry, so that visually they could be differentiated from each other. So even though I am using some of the colors that were in some of the photos, I'm also like adjusting them to make sure that they are looking more like the colors I want to tell my visual storytelling language. I have dropped in the background layer, which is going to act as like the surface in which I make all of my layers thereafter. The background layer is usually where I put the sky color, the back mountain colors that I am painting. Right now I just lasso tooled and dropped in the ground, and then I'm going to add like the foliage on top of that. What I'm doing is just like making a surface that I am going to then paint more like emotionally and intuitively on top of. This background is just the surface at which all of my other art is going to come after. So one of the things I also think about when I am working on a large project, which is a picture book is a large project, I think about the tone at the start of the book and at the end. The reference image that I just pulled up, which is the little girl laughing, Simone laughing in a forest, that image is from the end of the book, and I often like pace my illustrations so that we've got lightness and breeziness and fun at the beginning, and visually it will get more tense going towards the climax, and then at the end again it will usually get lighter. So an end illustration will bookend color wise and emotional wise how the book starts in the beginning. Usually, sometimes there are outliers where I like adjust that, but I want more of the visual tension, more of the drama in the illustrations and in the paintings to come more towards the climax. As this is a title page, it is the page that comes after the end papers. The end papers are the paste down papers when you open a picture book. The title page has literally the title that says like If Tigers Disappeared, written and illustrated by me, and it has my dedication on it. And that text will be put in later by the art director, the creative director, the design team. Right now, I just have to worry about painting this illustration, making sure it fits the mood that was established, making sure it fits the vibe that we like kind of discussed. So I have this background kind of like more or less in right now. You can see that there's a bunch of like roughed in sections of color. And what I'm doing right now is I'm adding the light hitting the trees. Now you have to think about, if we're in a forest, there are spots where the light comes in and it hits the trees, and there will be these like glow, kind of like with this glow behind the tree leaves. And like I said, this book is cooler in tone than If Elephants Disappeared, so I wanted to make sure that the light coming in from the background is bluer. It's not going to be warm, and therefore like the sky is going to be bluer, and then the trees will be bluer instead of like a yellow or an orange. And this will allow for the book to feel different from my other books, and also still feel like we are in a forest where there's some amount of light coming through. So that's what I'm doing right now. You're looking at the ground, you're looking at the mountains, you're looking at the denseness of the forest, you're looking at the initial light through the trees, and I am now putting in the road that they are driving on, the dirt road that they're taking through the forest. I mentioned earlier that I use two brushes that are basically the same. One is tighter and more streamlined, and the other is rougher. What I am using right now is the rougher brush. I'm using it at a smaller scale, so it looks like fairly tight, but you can tell that this is rougher than the one I used to do the fine lines that indicate like how the people are. And when I say like how the people are, I mean the detail on the people I was illustrating earlier. So right now I'm going in with the road through the forest, which I am going to just kind of start building up using light, dark, and then a combination, a medium ground in between. And you can see that I've put in the light, I'm going with some dark, and then I like eyedropper into something that feels a little bit more in between. I want to not only show that there's like sand and dirt on the ground, but I also want it to blend in. So there is some amount of like greens I want to pick up and have in there too. Something I was just thinking about is how fast I feel like I'm moving across the screen as I'm watching this back. And I want you to know that this is not sped up. The only part I did speed up, for full disclosure, is that I did speed up me like labeling the files or the layers. And that's just because that was kind of boring to watch. But that was 140% speed. And this right now is just regular speed. I do work pretty quickly. And I will say, like, when I was looking at this file and I saw that it was 2 hours, that felt astronomically quick to me to do a spread. And as I'm looking at this, I'm like, that's why it's quick, because this is the 5th book in the series, right? I have kind of honed the style that I want this book to be illustrated in, not just because I have done 5 books, but because I also have done like a lot of work to prep for these books and do other types of artwork around them, like the character design. So I have gotten pretty good at the shorthand for this style. And so I know kind of like how to do this pretty well. So right now, yeah, I am moving relatively quickly across the screen. I'm also, I mentioned this earlier, but like I am painting intuitively at this point. You can see that I know where the road is just based off of like how the brush is going, but you'll see that I don't carry the road over completely to the right because I don't really need to. This is all we're gonna see. The brush and the foliage is gonna cover the rest of it. So right now, as I'm doing this, I know kind of like what I need, and as I work through this, I will like find areas where I don't know what I need, and I'm gonna fix that. But in this situation, like I'm going quickly because I know what I need, and I'm also just like painting from my heart, which I think is part of what I find so joyous about these books. The information in these books is not the happiest. They are a nonfiction picture book series about what happens when keystone species disappeared. So with that information, you know that I am about to talk about what happens if tigers disappear from their ecosystem, what happens to the ecosystem, and the devastating effects that take place. The research phase is really hard of these books. There's a reason I ended up having to cap these books at 5. I find them difficult to work on, but I found the art really fun and like really liberating to make because I got to just kind of get into it, play music, and just paint. And once I have, the sketch where I know where the things are going to go in the illustration, I am able to sort of lean in and just like vibe with the art that I'm making. And that's sort of what I'm doing right now. I'm making the brush larger and smaller, and I am finessing in these spaces. And there is an amount of which I want this to feel loose and free, in the same sense of why I want the art to feel cartoony, because that information is dense, right? If I gave you really realistic illustrations, like 1980s style, like much more realistic scientific illustrations, I don't think you, as a viewer, specifically my audience, which is children, would maintain the information the best way possible. And the reason for that is because it's already big information. I am aware that it can be sad. Luckily, in all of my years of reading my books to kids, I've only ever had one kid tear up. The rest of them usually feel like really excited to make change when they read these books. So I wouldn't argue that my books are sad, but the information in them can be sad. And because of that, I counteract that with my artwork. I want some of the background artwork to feel free. I want the kids to feel cartoony, and that vibe that like I'm infusing into this work helps, I think, the science feel more approachable. So this is a very conscious thing that I have thought through as I'm illustrating. And I say that as I'm kind of like putting in these really big, free, fun strokes of this digital brush. I'm painting in a way that feels fun and free, but I am also really cognizant of how the artwork pairs with the writing, which I think is really important. I'm adding in some shadows now behind what will eventually be the car and the main characters. This will allow them to pop more. The car is going to be white, and then if I'm adding this darkness, this will help make sure that this kind of corner frames them. One of the things I'm also always thinking about as an illustrator is making sure that your eye is traveling to the area of the artwork I want it to travel to. When you are learning like art and illustration, you will learn composition and various techniques that make your eye draw to what you want the eye to draw towards. So one of the things I'm thinking about is guiding the viewer through my page. I want them to be able to look at all of the different things on the page, but as an illustrator, I'm also dealing with text, right? There's text on this spread. There's going to need to be areas where the illustration isn't as like detailed, and because of that, that will also help draw the eye in towards where the characters are. So right now I am making this bush, and the details behind the characters more fleshed out. Again, though, I'm still just like painting with what I feel, getting that like emotion onto the page. I'm always having to push myself to make sure that I add more darkness and more lightness. Like I think one of the things I tend to do is I tend to play it safe and like play with mid-range colors. And so as I'm working on my books, especially the books that like have a forest in them, like if elephants disappeared and if tigers disappeared, I have to make sure I'm playing with that darkness, because when you're in a forest, there can be really dark areas of like your visual field. So I am pushing that right now, and with that focus on the shrubbery that is around where these characters are going to be and where I want you to kind of look, because there's not going to be any text where the characters are. There's going to be text right now where I have this like placeholder text that says if tigers disappear, and then underneath where the characters are towards the left of the page, there's also going to be a dedication. But right now I want you to be able to focus on the characters and to be able to look at them and your eye to be drawn in towards them. One of the things I'm really passionate about talking about as a artist and as an art educator is the concept that artists are approaching their artwork with years of knowledge and training, and that when you hire an artist to do something, you aren't just paying for like their hours right now in the same way that you would be paying someone with a different type of skill to do that. I'm not saying that's right, I'm just saying that's kind of how that works. You're paying for artwork that a person has taken like a lifetime to get better at. So when I am like intuitively making some of these choices, this is not just something that I'm doing because it's easy. This isn't easy for me. And that's something I'm also really big on talking about publicly. This is something I talk to kids about when I do my school visits. This is something I talk to kids about at school as an art teacher, because I teach K-6 art. Art is work. That's why we call it artwork. And so as I'm making these decisions, I'm making them from the perspective of years of practice and years of honing of my skills. It's not just like me sitting down and, oh, this is easy. It's me figuring out how to do something over and over and over again, and then putting it into practice here. And yes, it's easier this time because I've done it so many times before. So right now, you just saw that I made like a little gap where the light was shining through, and then I rethought it. And I thought maybe it didn't look quite right, and I didn't want that amount of light shining through. I do want more light shining through than I had, so I'm going over some of the art I just did. And you might be thinking, oh my gosh, what are you doing? You've just erased stuff that you just worked on. And I know, because this is part of the intuitiveness that has come to me over a lifetime of being trained in this, right? I'm not just trained in this because I practice all the time. I'm trained in this also because I went to school for this. And yeah, at this point, I was in like my 8th or 9th year, I think, of being a children's book illustrator. So I am doing this from a place of practice. Maybe it was 7th year. So right now I'm figuring some things out. I had the blue there, and it was working, but I'm going to overlap a tree here. And you can see that I am still following the sketch that I set out to follow, but I'm also just like intuitively trying to figure out what looks good and using my artistic lens through my years of practice to figure out what is working for me as I'm painting this, what feels right, what feels like it's continuing to direct the eye the way I want. And also I have to make sure, like I said earlier, that I'm leaving room for text and making sure that I'm not making things too busy underneath where the text is. So right now what I'm doing is I'm going in and I'm going to start making this darker. I had thought maybe the light was going to shine through, but I'm rethinking that. I'm going through and I'm going to make this darker because the text is going to really pop on that, and it will continue to do what I want, which is push your eye towards the things that I want you to look at, the characters that are on the left side, and it will allow the text right here to pop too. You can see that in my rough sketch, I have a bush that's going to be in the foreground. Right now I am painting the background, and that bush or shrub is going to be in the foreground, popping up and out. So I have to find some amount of middle ground where this is dark forest. It allows the text to pop. It's not too busy, so it still feels like I've illustrated it, but it's still blank enough that the text can go on it. And then there's going to be a shrub in front, which I'm going to think about later. That's not an issue for right now. I've just laid in some darker color. Now I'm going over to the left and I'm going to start mapping in some of the trees over here. Now this blue has been sitting here. Like I said earlier, this blue is the light shining through. Again, I wanted this book to be more cool tone greens, so I'm kind of mixing some warm tone greens with my cool tone greens and highlighting where I can with cool tones, and then using this back page from the end of the book as reference for this page in terms of color. So I'm grabbing some of my colors from there and I am mapping in this tree, still allowing that cool light to shine through behind it, and then using my painterly brush strokes with that big, larger brush, rougher brush, to map in this tree. Something that I really do focus on with these books is making sure that the backgrounds feel sort of like matte painterly. I want them to feel like a setting in which the characters are on top of. Now, this is not just because these books are about like animals, and the characters are important vehicles for you to see yourself in the story. But I do focus in on certain parts of the environment as the story goes on. So I do make things look more detailed at certain other points, but it is an artistic choice to make this look a little bit more matte painterly against the characters that feel a little bit more detailed. So right now I'm adding those darker layers on top of that blue and then finessing in with like a medium tone in between the dark and the light and going in and just kind of... The background is where you have to really like set the scene. And I think it's probably... I thank you for your patience. It's not usually the most fun to talk about because I'm not actually painting or illustrating at this point the focal point of the illustration, right? Which is, again, the car with the characters in it. At this point, I'm just setting the scene, and that's got to be accurate. It's got to look like India. It's got to look like the mountains. It has to have the color scheme I want, and it has to fit the artistic style that I have already laid out for the other books. So I'm setting the scene. I'm doing basically a lot of background work, literally, that is less glamorous than when you're setting the focus point of your illustration. This has to look good. It also has to do a bunch of functional things, make you understand where we are in time and place. It needs to move your eye around the art the way I want so far, and really just provide the stable foundation for the rest of the illustration to shine. So at this point, I am kind of like wrapping up with how I feel this needs to be. It doesn't need to be too detailed in the background. It needs to be more detailed in the foreground. So I also don't want to get too tight on my background. I still want it to be loose. And that's something I had to be really conscious of through every single book. I think we as people, or maybe I'm just speaking for myself, me as an artist, I tend to find that I want to get tighter with my work as I go. And I have to always push myself to be loose and fluid. And so I do want my background to be more fluid because, as you will see, I'm about to move up to the foreground in a second. And as they move up to the foreground, we're going to have more detail. We're going to have leaves. We're going to have much more that you as a viewer can grab onto. It's going to be closer to you. You're going to want more detail. And when I get closer, I have to balance like how much detail is too much detail versus the background. I do just want to focus on maintaining looseness there. So I'm getting really happy with how this is looking now. I'm going to start my way working towards the foreground. I'm going to add in some darkness so that those front shrubs can pop and blend in some of the greenery that the road will sit upon. As I'm getting closer to working on the foreground, I'm going to also start switching my layers. So I've been working strictly in like background layers, and now I'm going to start moving towards foreground layers. The images that I'm pulling up are images from my book and my reference images, which I'm referencing for color and tone, which I'm going to keep using. So now we're moving on to the front shrubs. And as you can see, I have switched my layers. I'm now going to work on one literally called front foliage. I am trying to add some brighter color to the front, brighter and lighter. In the very back where the mountains are, you can see that I have pushed the perspective by indicating that there is some like atmospheric haze back there. It's a little bit more dull than the forest. And then I have made shadows in the background. This will allow for when I add brighter colors to the front for your eye to settle there, which also allows for the foreground, middle ground, background to serve its purpose visually. Right now I'm adding lighter colors to the front shrub the way I did to the back shrubs, where the light's going to be hitting it. It's going to illuminate the leaves. I think A Bug's Life is a fantastic example of how illuminated the leaves often look when you're in various perspectives in plants. And so I'm trying to achieve just a little tiny bit of that in some of my plants. So I'm adding like this bright color, which I will end up like darkening up, but it's supposed to indicate the light hitting the plants. I don't use a ton of shadows in this book series in general, and that was a stylistic choice that I set out to make in If Sharks Disappeared. If Sharks Disappeared is the first book in this series. This book came about because I made 3 infographics that went viral. I was a senior in college at the time working on my senior project, which is an animated short film. I got a degree in animation, so the animated short film that I made is on the same topic. And through the process of making a short film and then also simultaneously trying to make a children's book, I did a lot of art tests. I tried to figure out what art would stylistically capture a lot of the things that I wanted to achieve. And one of the things I mentioned earlier is this idea that I didn't want the artwork to be really serious. And I think that works for a lot of nonfiction books. So that is not me disparaging that style at all, because I really love realistic artwork. I'm not really a realistic artist. I love cartoony artwork. I tend to stray towards a more commercial cartoony style myself. I can do more realistic artwork, but my preference is what I'm doing now. Painterly stuff with cartoony accents. I'm also a graphic novelist, so I do very cartoony artwork. I really wanted to pair this cartoony, painterly, mostly flat art style with the heaviness of the text. Again, I don't think the text is too heavy. I'm qualified to be able to make work for children. I know what I'm doing. It's not too heavy, but it is heavier. It's not just like a happy book about tigers and like all information about tigers. It's about like ecosystem collapse. And because of that, I felt very acutely aware when making If Sharks Disappear that I wanted to entice the viewer to get excited about sharks first and then have the information sort of like come up on you. Not that I'm trying to sneak this into people's repertoire, but I was really aware that like if this turned people off from the get-go, they wouldn't be receptive to the information that I had in there. So as an artistic decision, I made sure this wasn't too shadowy, pretty flat. The painterliness does have like light and dark in it, but it's not, there's not like a huge shadow under where like a character is standing. And these are all decisions I made to pair with the text. And that's, I think, the benefit of being an author and illustrator. When I get a book from an author, I, as an illustrator, make similar decisions. I try to figure out what I think the book needs visually. I have to even sometimes create visual narrative arcs that aren't even in the text. The illustrator does a lot of heavy lifting in a different way than the text does. And as the author and illustrator, I have control of both aspects. So not only do I get to make the text the tone that I want, but then I also get to control the art and the tone of the art, which is something that is really special and something I really love about being the author and the illustrator. A lot of the humor, a lot of the heart, a lot of the visual, like the capturing of your attention and the visuals is up to me. And I also get to control it in the text. So it's really a balancing act that I get to strike as the overall creator. Obviously, I am edited. There's an art director. There's like feedback I get along the way. I do not control what the text looks like. I get to say I like it and don't like it, but thankfully I don't get to really design it, which is not something I feel like is my strong suit. So all this to say is a lot of the decisions I'm making here while I'm having fun and painting intuitively came from a place of storytelling and visual storytelling knowledge. I wanted this to look a very specific way, and I was able to execute it, thankfully, because my skills were up to that standard. I have just gone back and forth, and I have made highlights and shadows in this front shrub. They're not too dark, meaning they are not darker than the ones in the background, so it still feels like it's right up in the foreground, but overall they are brighter and a little bit of a different green, so that you feel like it's up closer to you in the front. Now, I have also been toggling back and forth between my different front shrub layer and like a few different layers in the front, versus in the background, everything but the road is pretty much on the same layer. And this is so I can have control, and if I need to move anything, I can. And at this point, I'm now just kind of going over and unifying the shrub. Now that might seem wild. I think you've seen me do that a few times now. I create like different highlights and shadows, and then I go over them and kind of mute them a little bit. And that's so right now I know that there's going to be text here. So while it can have some amount of depth and some value differentiation, I don't want it to be so great that you can't pick a text color or a text value to go over this area. And eventually right here, there's going to be just like some information about the book, the publisher, and a dedication. And the dedication is usually on the other page from where the title text is, and the title text is always on the right. So at this point, I know that I'm making space here for the dedication to go, which is why I don't add leaves to the whole thing. I'm going to start going in and making some leaves here so that you know that this is a shrub. There's some amount of detail. I try not to get too detailed with leaves, or else I would be drawing leaves for the entire book. Because this book is set in a forest, I would be drawing leaves all the time. So I have to be strategic about where I'm drawing leaves. And this also helps make the background, which is really painterly, tie in more with the cartoony characters to have some more cartoony looking leaves. Again, this is just a different artistic decision that I'm making, and I'm just trying to walk you through like why I'm making certain decisions. So I sped up the leaf drawing a little bit. You can see that I'm strayed just a touch from the artwork in the background, which I'm using as a reference and a guide for what my leaves are going to look like in the end, but not the be-all end-all. This allows me to have some freedom to make decisions in the moment that I feel are going to look better in the book. One of the things I do when working on each of these books is I set a specific location that I know this book is in, so that when I'm working on the artwork, I can best represent that area to the best of my abilities. Now, this book is set in India, like I said. It's about tigers, specifically Bengal tigers, and what would happen if they disappeared. And spoiler alert, like many countries in the world, India has I don't know if it's well guided, but they're trying to help save tiger populations, and by doing so, they're actually relocating native people off of their land. So indigenous people are being moved off of their ancestral land for tiger populations to be protected on that land, which, if you're American, sounds pretty familiar. My uncle Michael Beninoff has a nonprofit called Traditional Cultures Project, and he works with people around the world that are in danger of going extinct due to issues like this. He's written books on similar things. One of his books, which is a fantastic read, and I really recommend it if you're interested in more information about issues similar to these but not the same, it's called Himalaya Bound. The people that I feature, and I apologize if I mispronounce anything, I don't speak other languages very well, but this book takes place in the BR Hills in India. Specifically, I focus on the Saliga tribe in Karnataka, and these people have struggled with being relocated from their land or being moved around by the Indian government. So the little girl featured in this book is a visual representation of a person who might be from the Saliga tribe in India. Being an American and a white American, I'm very aware that I'm going to have cultural and racial blind spots to a lot of these issues. So I do my best to get multiple other perspectives and a lot of other education so that I do the best job I can. Ultimately, my books are always about the animals and the ecosystems, not as much about the people. But what I have found in working on these books is that the emphasis should always be on the fact that the indigenous people who are from this ancestral land have the best understanding of how to protect this land. The people who have spent all of their lifetimes and generations on this land are the best stewards of the land. And it's because they have a different relationship to it than a lot of the other people who eventually move there and have come with like Western sensibilities and other sensibilities where they think they know better. So this is all to say that these books are about animals, but I felt really grateful that my research and my reading and my interviewing with experts on If Tigers Disappeared allowed me to actually include that message that indigenous peoples are the best stewards of their land. And I'm really glad that out of all my books, I was able to get that in some capacity, and that is really the backbone of If Tigers Disappeared. There's no like flawless way to transition from that to going back to the art, but I just wanted to point out that I have made the leaves more like two-toned now and added the finer brush, the brush that is closer together and tighter. I have added like leaf lines to add some details. This is something that I'm not going to again do through the whole entire thing, but up front right here, as a way to again like continue to help draw your eye back to where the truck will be and where the characters will be. This puts some of that detail that the characters will also have on them right up in some of the foliage, and that kind of creates a through line, bringing this painterly style to connect it to the more cartoony characters that are on top of the background. So another stylistic choice that I've made to avoid just drawing a million leaves is to highlight where there might be some definition in leaves and light. Again, this is like very stylistic, and I do it throughout all of the books. It's this kind of like dappled light effect. It's most apparent and most needed in this book because it's set in the forest, and in If Elephants Disappeared because that's also set in a forest. I do have some more of this included in If Bees Disappeared too, because there's a lot of foliage in that book, but it's in a different way. It's in more like plants in a garden because that book's set in the United Kingdom in Kent. So right now I'm just kind of like finessing what is eventually going to be like the finale of these this front shrub. Just finessing the shadow, the value, making sure it feels like that the viewer's eye is going to be drawn back in towards the car again. And then I'm going to add this like dappled light effect that I will put throughout the entire book. I just want to show you what we started off with at first. And this is what we were working with. It's so different than where we are now. I think that's probably the coolest thing that happens when you make art, is you start with this thing that will eventually become something else entirely, a blank page or this sketch, for instance, and now it looks totally different. I always make sure that I add branches and twigs and trunks to the shrubs and the trees so that you can see not only the shape of the tree or the shrub that I'm making, but also the indication that there is the stem and the wooded part of the tree. Again, I do this in a more stylistic manner. For instance, like the trees are very shape languagey. I've chosen these blobs to move your eye around, like I've said earlier. I'm worried I'm just repeating myself, but hopefully I'm giving you good information. And now I'm adding the details. So at this point, I'm using the tighter brush to get the twigs and the branches in there, adding a little bit of color definition with the more rough brush on top of them. And this area, like I've said a few times, is where there's going to be a dedication. There's going to be text. So the value difference can't be so extreme in this area that a text and like text won't work over it if it's got too many different values. One of the things I just mentioned is shape language. Something that I am always constantly striving to put in my work is this understanding of shape language. And while I don't necessarily mean exact shapes like circle, triangle, rectangle, etc., I do kind of mean that. It comes from that. It comes from the basic shapes. But you use it in a more sophisticated way once you've used it for a long time. It starts from the basic shapes, and you are using them as a way to direct your eye or imply other meaning to your work. For instance, like a circle is a softer shape than a triangle or a square, right? In basic terms. But also you can use those shapes to direct the viewer's eye. And something I've mentioned many times throughout the first 45 minutes of me describing of this video is that I am trying to direct your eye. That's something I'm very conscious of in all of my illustrations, is how are you traveling through the illustration to get the information that I'm providing? Where are you being directed, and where is your eye traveling? Right now, just so you know, I am adding the dappled light that I talked about. This is something that I really started doing most in If Elephants Disappeared, and just really kind of incorporated into the style of this book. The style of this book started with If Sharks Disappeared, but obviously with every single book I worked on, the style got improved upon and added to, and I troubleshot many different things that I was working with to make it. So I'm also going to start adding these like little grasses, and that's mostly just because like when you look at different bushes and shrubs out in nature, there's often all sorts of different little plants all throughout. So this adds some other textural element that's not wood, isn't leaves, it's just another type of like plant nearby. Okay, back to talking about shape language. I talk about shape language and do like a much more in-depth lesson on this in my costume and character design class on the Cuttlefish Academy. It's an online course that I have, and I'm not trying to sell that to you right now. I'm just saying that it is something I think about specifically much more when it comes to character designs. I think about the characters, and my work is much more character focused often than atmospheric and background oriented. So while I am working on the background right now, and I am working on the lush forest that makes up this illustration, the character designs are where I often focus the shape language concept. Now, shape language is something I feel like I'm always aware of, and it is, I remember asking one of my friends who I interned with in animation, and I was like, how do you use shape language so well? And she was like such a master of it. She was a few years older than me, and I was always so impressed by the way she just naturally incorporated shape language into her character designs and her environment designs. It felt like this secondhand thing. And one of the things she said to me is, when you start using shape language, it feels really clunky. You're starting to think about things not necessarily in terms of like anatomy and their actual form. Like, I'm not actually drawing a very specific type of plant. Sometimes I do in these books, but right now I'm mostly just trying to get the vibe of what we're seeing, what we're feeling. And so it's not genuinely a specific type of plant right now. It's more like a shrub that looks like the shrubs in the images that I'm looking at. And I'm focusing more on making sure that the shape is doing what I want versus is this shrub 100% accurate. And I have the ability to do this because I'm working in narrative nonfiction. Narrative nonfiction is what this type of nonfiction is called. It's a relatively, I don't want to say it's necessarily new, but it's very popular right now in children's books. And it's the concept that your nonfiction reads more like a traditional picture book than it does a true nonfiction like book that we think of if you're a child of the 80s and 90s or earlier. Our nonfiction was a little bit more bland. If you were a child of the 2000s and earlier, you are lucky because that was when narrative nonfiction was like starting to take off more. And it's this idea that you're telling a picture book story that's nonfiction in the way you would tell a normal picture book story. Jessica Lannon did an incredible, she's an author and illustrator. She's a Cybert honor author and illustrator. Cybert is one of the biggest awards you can win in nonfiction picture books. And she did a fantastic talk that I went to the other year at an SCBWI conference for. And it was all about narrative nonfiction. It was really interesting because I do narrative nonfiction, and I work in narrative nonfiction. I'm very aware of like what I'm doing when I'm doing it, but going to her talk, I felt like I got this really wonderful bird's eye view of what I'm doing when I work on these things. And this is all to bring you back to, so I have the luxury to make sure not everything is 100% exactly how it is if you are taking a photo of it, because as the illustrator of narrative nonfiction, I am really working on the storytelling aspect of my illustrations, making sure that they also read like picture book illustrations, not necessarily a nonfiction textbook illustration. And one of the ways I go about doing that is really incorporating shape language into my process. So just to bring you back to what you're seeing on the screen right now, you're seeing me finally tackling the frontmost shrub. This shrub blocks your view of the background, so I have to make sure that the background feels like it's pushed behind the shrub, so it's much darker. The shrub is going to be a lot lighter, and because of that, the text is going to need to definitely be like some sort of middle ground color. And I am thinking about that as I'm working on this, but the art director, the designer are going to work more on the text than I will. I write the text, they put it in the like physical text. So I am going to make sure that it's some amount of color that will work with whatever text color is laid over it. But I am also making sure that the shrub looks like it's popped in front of the background. It needs to be in front of the pathway, the road on the back. So I've also indicated that it goes, you can see the road now a little bit because I've indicated that on the background area. And you can see I'm also like in the sketch, there will be branches and the little like wooded part of the shrub there too. So working with shape language, I'm very aware that I want to keep these initial images where you're entering this world in this book gentle and soft. At some point, I might worry more about if the world feels a little bit harsher, which I can control through things like color theory and shape language. But as of right now, we are entering this book. We are excited. We are like the characters in this book on this page. We're looking around. We're taking it in. We are being introduced to the BR Hills in India through these characters on this page. And because of that, I have these big, soft, billowy shrubs in the front, which I am going to make appealing green colors and make everything feel inviting so that you as a viewer are invited into this world. I started with a very bright color on this shrub, and that's because that allowed it to offset from the background. And because this is in the foreground, it is going to be a little bit lighter than the background. But what you're going to see me do right now is I'm going to start making the value a little bit darker overall. The light hitting any plant will make the ends of it or like the surrounding edges look a little bit lighter as the light is like illuminated through the semi-translucency of the leaves and everything. So what I'm doing right now is I had this brighter color. It offset it for me as the creator of this, so I could see where I mapped out that shape language. I could visually see what this shrub was really going to do in the front of this image. And then now I'm going to go kind of reduce the value by layering in some other greens. We've got medium greens, darker greens now, and I'm also going to start thinking about other colors. Shrubs aren't just, a wonderful like classic green. They've also got things like brown in them, blues in them, sometimes even like burgundies and purples. It just depends on the type of shrub. And from my reference images, this is kind of like the general type of shrub I'm going for. As of For this book, it's not as important that I get all the plants 100% correct. That's not the message of this book. And like I said, because it's narrative nonfiction, I can play with these things and I can make them more cartoony and more artistic in different ways that I want to. And that's something I am doing right now. So I'm thinking about all these things, shape language and color and how light hits plants and what type of plants I'm using and how I want your eye to go as I'm like painting. And because I have done this for years and I've been a professional at this for quite a while, some of these things are just second nature. It's kind of like that thing where when you get good at something and someone asks you to explain what you did, it's kind of hard to explain what you did. So as I'm going through this, I will say, I like I said at the very start of this, I recorded this in 2021. This book came out in 2022. And as I'm recording the audio for this, it's 2025. I kind of have a different perspective on this book now. I'm not actually sure I would have been able to have like told you everything I'm doing in 2021 because I don't think I had the time and space I needed to be able to reflect on what I'm doing. I've been able to like look at this book so many times, read it to so many different kids, and think about the art that I've made in a different way. Just like how when I look at If Sharks Disappeared, that book came out in 2017. You know, that was a while ago. So when I look at the artwork, not only do I see all of the things I would do differently because I'm me and I'm the creator of my own work, but also I see like a lot of the decision making I made at the time, and I can see it with more clarity because I have some time and distance from it. Right now I'm going back in with that tighter brush. I think this is the looser one. Yep, this is the more rough one, and I'm just getting the branches in there and laying in. These look like shockingly close to what I actually had drawn, which is kind of funny because some of these don't look like what I have in the background. What I'm essentially doing is flatting in the color first. I flat in the color of the shrub. I flat in the color of the background. I flat in the color of the road. I'm flatting in the color of the branches. And I am then adding depth to it and different values later. That's not my first thought. My first thought is to just get a solid color so I can see where my lines are, where my shape is at first. My priority is to be able to track what I'm doing initially. So I usually do start with a lighter color because of that. So right now we're starting with a lighter brown because of that. If I left it this the way it is, to me it doesn't look finished. I've got this like background that's like painted a little bit. I've got this flat on top of it. I think it needs more depth. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add value depth to the wooded part. And then I'm also going to add that dappled light effect with those little like dashed lines to the shrub. And as you can see, I took a very bright shrub that I placed on there and I reduced the value of it. And it already looks like it kind of blends well with the background. I should say it pairs well with the background while still feeling like it's pushed forward. It feels like it's up front, but also it's almost like vignetted on this part of the illustration, right? This whole right side of the illustration is darker, not just so that If Tigers Disappeared text can lay on top of it cleanly and that can pop, but also so that your eye again is pushed towards the characters in the little truck. Like you want the eye to visually be wrapping around your illustration, going where you want. And the shape of this shrub, where it like kind of moves gently and slopes into the other one, the fact that it is darker at the top right and has some lighter bits on the bottom left are all things that I am sort of instinctually doing, but like subconsciously thinking about. I'm probably thinking about them like a touch, but there becomes a point where this stuff is more natural and it does kind of just like start to intuitively happen. So while there's an amount in which I am thinking about it, I am also kind of just like going with the flow and seeing what comes out of my pencil or my digital pen, I guess, my Cintiq pen, and like figuring it out as I go. So right now I am adding that shadow, that darkening those branches. And again, this is also making it's also making the front shrub seem a little bit darker, even though I actually didn't just add any darkness to the background of the shrub. It's just the branches, which now allows the shrub overall to still feel a little bit darker. I don't want any aspect of my natural world to feel too soft, squishy, clean, or smooth. While I'm fine with it being cute and gentle, I don't want it to be like too manufactured. That's just something I prefer with my own artistic style. So right now I am going in with sort of like shadows and highlights, and you can see that they're not really even, and that's because like bark isn't even. That's because when you look at the wooded part of any shrub, it's not even. So sometimes I make decisions that feel like messy, and even as I'm doing them, I sometimes want to smooth them out and make them feel more organized. And I have to remind myself that we are in nature that is unmanicured. It is not a forest. Even when I was working on If Bees Disappeared, which takes place in mostly a garden in England, I'm thinking about like an English country garden as I'm working on that. And the English country gardens aren't always the most like pristine. So I was also conscious to like make sure there were paths of dirt, and that in that dirt there were tiny weeds. So right now with this shrub, you can see that behind the shrub there's this like dark area that is not really part of the shrub. You can even see part of the road at the top of it coming through like the back of the shrub. And I'm going to go in a minute and add some texture there. So as I'm looking at this shrub, I can also see that it's feeling smooth to me. And not just in the terms of like, do I need to add leaves or something, but I think it needs another push of texture. And I was even thinking that, and then I like scrubbed forward in my video as I was recording the audio here and the narration. And I was like, yep, thankfully, I'm so glad past me had the same thought that present me had. Is if I was looking at this right now and I were to offer critique to this artist, I would say that right now this is a little smooth, that the background can be more smooth because it needs to blend in a different way than the foreground does, but that this shrub in particular is a little smooth. It could use another push in value. I'm really happy with the push in the value that the branches have, but the shrub itself needs a little bit more depth. It just needs something rougher so that it feels more natural and a little bit less man-made. Right now, I'm going to go in and add some highlights to the shrub and some lowlights to just push that rougher value again. You can see that I'm adding highlights to kind of like emphasize the branches and make it seem rougher. Already, I'm liking how this is looking. And then I'm going to add some shadows to do essentially the same exact thing, but in reverse. We just want to push how a kind of a shrub looks in real life, messy, especially one that you find like in the woods. If you have made it this far, I want to say thank you. We are at the 1 hour mark now, and I have talked really mostly about background and foreground, which I would argue like are slightly less fun to talk about than the character designs, but maybe it's just because I love doing the character design stuff just like a little bit more than the backgrounds. That's my own personal preference. Many people also love the backgrounds more, but I tend to lean towards more character driven stuff, and I really do enjoy illustrating the characters a lot. So we are almost to the characters, but we are kind of just finalizing that background so that eventually when I do the characters, the only thing I need to think about at the very end is just what I can do to just make it absolutely pop and be finished. So I am adding that dappled light effect now to this front shrub. And then the front shrubs should be done. They have their dappled light, they have their leaves, they have their twigs and branches, and things feel kind of like natural and a little bit messy. As messy as I can do as someone who's like pretty organized. I also will add some natural texture, some small low-lying plants and other various things to the ground that you're seeing behind this shrub in particular. You can see that there's greenery that connects the green of where the shrubs are and the plants around there to the road, And if you've ever been on like any sort of dirt road, you know that it's not just like clean dirt and there's nothing poking through it. Especially if you're in a lush area, there's always going to be some amount of plant life like breaking through here and there. Something I love is I live in Colorado, and my husband and I do go four-wheeling quite a bit. And when you four-wheel, there are so many cool things on those wonderful, like less traveled dirt roads. Obviously they're roads, so you are allowed to travel on them, but there are like little things like little strawberries running around or like along the roadside. And so that's what I'm going to indicate here. That's not the main focus of the spread again, so I'm not going to get too nitty gritty making sure they're 100% accurate to every single thing in this area. I'm going to just mostly focus on making sure that you can see that there is an indication of plant life there. Something I used to do a lot as an artist is I would get really into all the tiny details. And I had a mentor at one point say, I want you to back up, zoom out, and focus on that shape language. And like I said earlier when I was talking to the other intern, and she said shape language will come more naturally to you later. The idea of incorporating shape language a lot into my work was really hard initially, but now it's become something that I am much more natural at because I have practiced for so long. So at this point, I can tell that I don't need to get nitty gritty on all the precise intricacies of the tiny little low-lying ground plants back here. But if I indicate them, that's enough. If I indicate them with some clear shape language, that is enough to communicate that you're looking at something that has texture to it and it's not just like a smooth expanse. It's nature, it's messy, it's layered. So right now I'm getting in there and I'm putting some little tiny plants, making sure they're not too dark, but just light enough that you see some amount of textural indication that they are there. Where the dirt sort of blends in with some of that darker greenery of the foreground, I'm going to also want to overlap some of these low-lying little plants to show that they go up onto some amount of the road. You can see that there's an indication that the plant life and the road, the dirtness, the dirt. What the heck? The dirt of the road. Oh my god. Dirtness Everdeen. Okay, I'm back. And I don't know why I said that, but the dirt you can see goes into the greenery coming into the foreground. I'm going to also bring that greenery into the dirtness area because I want to bring it up so you can see some amount of texture more clearly. The texture, the dark on the dark, is subtle, but when you bring the dark up onto a lighter surface, I think it just kind of does something that makes it look finalized. When I look at this foreground, I'm like, that looks really good. That looks like what I want it to look like. What you're seeing right now is I'm zooming out. I'm making this smaller so I can see what else I think this needs from afar. You have to remember that when you're like reading a picture book to kids, you're not always necessarily like upfront with them. If they're your kids, you're probably, they're close to it. But sometimes like I read books to a lot of kids at once, and so I'm often far away. So I always want to make sure my work reads further away too. So I will often zoom out, zoom in, just making sure I'm not like only working at a very zoomed in level, which is something you can be totally guilty of with digital illustration, is zooming in and then working really tight and then zooming out, and there not being that consistency. And because of that reason and multiple other reasons, I make sure that the foreground has a certain level of detail, that the midground, foreground, middle ground, background, right? So the foreground's going to have most detail along with the characters. The middle ground's going to have a medium amount of detail. The background's going to have the least amount of detail. And what I'm doing right now is I'm adding some amount of that, like little grasses, I don't want to use the term like weeds, because what is a weed? Like a weed is just a plant that shouldn't be there, or an invasive species. So I'm just adding some amount of texture, tiny little like blades of grasses and things like that to some of this. where it's less detailed than the detail I've added to the foreground, but there is some amount of texture I'm making sure is consistent throughout, and maybe the least amount in the background. Now I'm adding some highlight areas to the road. I feel like this just also just like finishes the road. I am putting in these little tiny lines that are lighter, make the road just like pop, also make it feel like that light really truly is hitting this area, because there's like these little moments of the road that pop. I feel like that's just really finalizes the road and looks like super good. So that's something I do throughout on different roads in all my different books, is just add this little kind of like highlight on the road. And now I'm turning off my sketch, seeing what it looks like without that. Yep, it's looking pretty darn finalized, I think. We still have the people in the car to add, but I think this like background is looking really good right now. The ability to self-critique and self-reflect as you're working on any work, your writing work or your artwork, is really crucial. You're obviously not going to always be able to find every single issue, every single mistake, or any of that, but you are going to be able to give yourself feedback as you're going, right? So as much as I'm loving this, this isn't finalized. I'm not near the final yet. I am looking at this and I'm thinking, man, all these little tiny details I'm adding to this mid-ground would be really great in the background, just a few of them. And I think I need just a little bit more in the mid-ground. So I've added these little dots to the near where the lines are, so you can kind of see where like the highlighted dirt is on the dirt road. And I'm also going to now start adding some amount of texture to the background too. This will make the background feel more like cohesive with the whole entire thing. This will make the background start to have some of the amount of information the foreground has, and it will make it have some amount the midground has, without adding so much that it's as detailed as the foreground. I'm trying not to speed this entire thing up too fast. My own insecurity is telling me that it would be helpful if this was faster, that we are getting to the people soon, which we are, but like that, maybe that's what a viewer wants to see. And then I have to remind myself that I love watching people do all of this when I watch videos. So I've sped this and a few of these little sections up 140%, which isn't too much. It hasn't shaved that much time. So roughly you are looking at like the real amount of time that this has taken for me to do. The amount of times I've split up and put like one other thing in here is, this video, when I looked at it, is about 2 hours long, and we're at the 1 hour 10-ish mark here. And being at that time means that I'm roughly at that amount of time, which is very fast for like a final illustration. And if I was doing this in any other media besides digital, I'd probably be going much slower. I am a pretty fast artist, just my speed has always been something that, it's really interesting. I'm also a K-6 elementary school teacher, and when I see the kids blast through projects, I'm always like, slow down. Like, you don't need to rush. But then also as an artist, I tend to work fast. And at the same time, I am able to like do this kind of like constant self-critiquing, like zooming back like I'm doing right now, looking at what I'm doing, analyzing what else I need. That's what I'm doing when I'm zooming back. I'm literally self-critiquing. I'm zooming back, I'm seeing what I need, and then I'm able to dive back in, assess what I need, and jump back in and do it. So right now I'm like, okay, this needs a little bit more detail, just some like lines, rough lines for some texture on here. I've added detail now to the road, to the background, and now I'm going to add just like a little bit more to the front because I think it needs it. I zoomed out, I assessed, I gave myself some self-critique, and I am reapproaching, right? You're always allowed to change your mind. You're always allowed to make a new decision. You're always allowed to look at your work and be like, I need to do something differently. So right now I am adjusting this again. And as is a final piece of work, when I'm working on any of my final illustrations, again, zooming out, looking, assessing, going to zoom back in a second. I'm always thinking about the fact that this is going to be printed. I'm now decided that clearly the wood is a little bit too light. I think it's pulling your eye to it, and I want it to push your eye elsewhere, so darken it a little bit with the levels. Like I said, this is going to be printed. This is going to be in the Library of Congress. No pressure. I'm not going to be able to change this. So I need to make sure that I like it. And there's kind of like twofold thing that can happen there as I'm saying this. You can freeze up and be like, oh my God, this is it. This is my like shot to do this well. Or you can be like, I'm never going to do this perfectly, so I might as well do it the best I can. And I waffle between both of those things the entire time. So right now I am doing the best I can. Filming myself working always makes me like stressed out in a way that I don't get when I'm just like working privately. So I do know, and I do remember that when I filmed this, I was like slightly stressed that people would be watching it, which is interesting because now looking at this, I'm like, I don't know why. This is fine. I'm adding some more leaves to this shrub. I think it needed just another little something, another type of texture. We've got the painterly texture of the shrub. We've got the dappled light. We've got the wooded branches, and now I'm just adding a leaf texture so we have some more diversity of texture on this shrub, especially where you can see the amount of shrub versus like underneath the text. We just need a little bit more, I've decided, and so I'm adding that because you're allowed to change your mind. The other leaves on the other shrub have lines and multiple values in them. Right now, for just consistency of style, I am adding that to these. Just a secondary dark amount of color. So there's like 2 colors on this. It's so subtle, you'll probably not even be able to see it when it's printed. And then just like adding a little line to each of them. This is something that I really don't even think you can see it on the printed page because it's so dark. But for me, I just wanted to like finalize these little leaves. They're silhouette-y, but also just make sure they look like unified with the entire style branding I have set out to make on the leaves. I'm not going to be adding like leaves per se to the background because I don't need to add that much detail in the background, but I am going to add, and you can see it in my rough right now. You can see the tree trunks and tree branches that I have already drawn there, but they've been hard to see because it's dark on dark. I am now going to go in and kind of fill in those areas. I did want to make sure that there would be tree trunks and tree branches along the background, so I am going in and I am adding those back here in a dark, again, kind of silhouetted style. It looks kind of like the front, like what I did in the front, except the front is always going to have just a slightly higher percentage of detail. In the back, I don't need to worry on having as much detail, at least in my style. When I am doing all my research, I collect so many reference images that never really see the light of day because they're for me to understand the ecosystem, understand the plants, understand the animals. So I actually become very familiar with like different species of animals, different species of plants that are in each ecosystem, even though you might not necessarily be able to tell because I have cartooned so much of this, I have stylized so much of this. I am really thinking about like what I am drawing, and I do often have not only just like I do always have folders of images that I've collected, but I will always often have, in addition to that, like a internet window open where I have just like different plants and animals that I'm drawing pulled up so I can see those in a broader sense, in addition to like the reference images that I also have pulled up. That's the thing that's like hard about showing what I'm illustrating is I have kind of like referenced some of these images where I've like color dropped from them. A few times you've seen me do that. Those are not the only things I'm looking at right now. I am drawing on my Cintiq. That is the screen that I have recorded for this. It's Photoshop open on my Wacom Cintiq. And then I have it's hooked up to my computer, and then on my computer screen, I will have multiple different images that I am often like cycling through and looking at at the same time. There have been a few times where I've like paused, looked at the images. I'm usually like looking also at the other screen, which is like another thing that I didn't record that when I did this. So I didn't also like record that, and I feel like a little uncomfortable just showing so many other people's like imagery, their copyrighted photography and all that. So I've only showed a little bit because it's like something I've recorded, something I've included because it's part of my process. I don't want to show like a million other people's materials, but I am also looking at other people's like materials. I've watched videos about this. I'm just really trying to capture these ecosystems to the best of my ability, knowing that I will have like natural human blind spots that I will not understand. But like being well researched while trying my best will usually achieve the best result that I can get. In this spread in particular, we don't have a ton of animals. I will add one animal, like something to look forward to. There is an animal coming up that I'm going to add, and it is not a tiger. Because you might be thinking, oh, well, obviously you're going to add an animal to tiger. It's actually not a tiger yet. I'm just introducing the characters and in the ecosystem. So I don't necessarily always drop you in first spread with the tiger or with the animal I'm focused on, but I will add an animal at the very end of this. But right now I'm not focused on adding too many animals to this initial spread as to not overwhelm. I want this to be a calm entry point. There's going to be informational text on this spread that is not storytelling text and not connected to the narrative arc, and therefore I want this spread to be a gentle easing into the book. It will entice you to know more about the little characters that you're going to see. It will entice you to know more about the world, but there's no text on this page beyond the title and my name as the author and illustrator and like some like preliminary text that has to be included. So you as a reader don't often actually even read this page. So it's more like, it's just what I said, like it's an entry point to the book. So I'm not overwhelming with like a bunch of different animals on this spread or even a bunch of different plants. I am just trying to get you to feel softly launched into this world. Something I do throughout these books though is I have made sure that there are rabbits in every single one of these books. If Sharks Disappeared was probably the hardest pull for how I could fit a rabbit into that book. I love rabbits. I feel like I'm a rabbit girl. I had, through this series of books, I had 2 bunnies, Oliver and Owen, and now I just have Owen. And so I always make sure that I have rabbits in my books. In fact, like that's been kind of a fun game, as I will tell kids, like, you should count how many rabbits are in this book because some of them have many more than others. And I was really excited because there is a rabbit species that I do have in the background of If Tigers Disappeared later on as the book progresses. So if you're ever reading any of the If Animals Disappeared series, just so you know, there are hidden rabbits in every single one of my books. And if you're watching this and you're an older reader and you maybe aren't as interested in this book series, I also have rabbits sprinkled throughout my graphic novels as well. That is like my little mission, to always have rabbits in my books. Now that the trees and the branches and the trunks are all laid in the background, I feel comfortable starting to add the characters. So what I'm going to do is, because you cannot see the characters on the background, I'm going to just like eyeball turn off that background, right? I'm going to make sure that you can't see the background while I'm putting in the characters, just so I know that I'm putting the characters in correctly. I'm following the lines that I made sure to perfect earlier, and I can add in the colors I need. I am going to just flat in these in the same way that I flatted in these shrubs. I'm going to start with basic character colors, referencing my own reference colors from my own character design sketches, and then I am going to worry about like if I need to adjust the colors a little bit later on if they like fit with the background. That's like the worry for after I've flatted them in, when I start finessing them. I have made specific groups in my Photoshop layers that have different layers for each of the items in it. So this is the car group where I've got a I've got solids, lights, lines, and that's how I kind of categorize this. So right now I am adding the solid, the flat in of that car color. I will also have these for the girls too. I do like skin, hair, detail like lines, things like eyeballs and stuff. So I make sure that they're all in different layers and I can adjust them accordingly. That's something I do like about working digitally, is I can like kind of adjust these and finesse these to make sure that my character designs are like on consistent model throughout. One of the things I do not like doing is drawing cars though. So I will basically avoid anything that has to do with like cars or machinery in my illustrations. That's probably my least favorite thing in the whole world to draw. It's my husband's favorite thing and it is my least favorite thing. So right now I am flatting in that car and I have drawn that car, but working on cars is like not my favorite thing. I feel like I don't always do them very accurately. They're so much more mechanical to like the background, which you saw me do rather intuitively. And I don't feel like I get to be that like free or fun when I work on things like this. So right now I'm getting that car flatted in and then I will start adding the details on top of it. I'm also lasso tooling this. So what I'm doing is I actually add the outline with that brush that I like, so you have the texture on the edges, and then to save myself time, instead of having to go in and actually like color the whole entire thing in with my digital brush, I'm just lasso tooling it, dumping the color in. That it looks the exact same as if I were to sit there and color the whole thing. It just saves me like 10 minutes. So I've lasso tooled the solid color in. Right now, that little truck is flatted in exactly where I need. I can start working on the other things. I'm going to include this other little shape in the solid, but like things like tires and lights will be on different layers so that in case I need to add some dimension, some texture to that back solid layer, I'm not going to mess with like the tires, which would like get affected by that. So right now, adding in that bumper. So checking my reference, making sure that my car looks correct. It's looking pretty good. So I'm going to erase those wheel wells. Now, something that I will do in a second, and so I'm going to have you look at, is as I'm erasing the wheel wells, do you see that there is sort of like this green on top of the car that looks splotchy? So something isn't correct there. I have now realized as I'm working on this that there is some amount of textural overlay, probably just from like my Cintiq pen touching the like canvas accidentally on some other layer. So I'm gonna have to try to figure out which layer that's on. So that's what I'm doing right now. I'm going over here. I'm trying to figure out which layer that's on. I figured it out. I'm going to lasso tool all this like extra foliage that accidentally got in there and delete it. Now the truck looks good. It doesn't have random like textural foliage on it. I can go back to drawing the truck. We are going to add what are these called? Oh my gosh. The mirrors. Oh my goodness. My brain, recording this video has taken so long. My brain has left the building. I'm going to add the lights. I'm going to add the grill. And I'm also going to work on adding the tires. Something that I always have to like remind myself is there are 4 tires on a car. I often want to draw just like 2 and give up, which is also hilariously like my pet peeve when I see this in art, when people have drawn someone from profile and they've only drawn like 1 arm and 1 leg that you can see. So it's funny because I do consciously be like, do not forget those back tires. Don't do that thing that bugs you when you look at art and someone's drawn someone like completely flat as if they're like half of a human. Make sure you remember that this car has more than 2 tires, because cars have how many tires typically? 4, not 2. Okay, so speaking of that, I also have to like make sure I don't forget that back mirror, and I have to make sure that I get all the little details here. I don't necessarily need to count 100% correctly to make sure I have all this stuff 100% correctly. My art is not always going to be that type of art, and I think that when I talk to people who are starting out, students, people who are worried about their portfolios, that concern can be something that can trip you up, making sure that everything is uber correct, and then you can like get really in your head about stuff. And I would just remind you that it just needs to look mostly correct. And someone else might have a different perspective on that than me. And I recognize that they might say, like, that's not correct. It does need to be 100% correct. You need to make sure it has 16 grill marks, and if it has 16 grill marks. But that's not necessarily how I work. And I'm comfortable with the fact that that's not really how I work, and that's not really how my art looks. So right now, adding the lights to those little details that I have added. This spread is actually a little bit of a callback to the title spread in If Polar Bears Disappeared, where I have the characters on a little ATV in the Arctic. They're in Nunavut, Canada, and I have a scientist and a Nunavut girl showing Simone around this landscape. So this is actually a little bit of a callback to that, and it's really interesting when artists like reference their own work. Like, I'm not sure anyone else would necessarily know that, but I really loved how that spread turned out specifically. I actually really loved how the tires on that little ATV looked. So like getting to do this car, even though I'm sitting here telling you that I don't love doing cars, was actually like a fun challenge for me because I am referencing my own work. I'm doing like the Tigers in India version of this other spread that I really enjoyed and thought turned out really well. So specifically when I get to do the tires on this, I was actually like excited for that, even though I find tires like kind of stressful to draw, like a whole car, incidentally. But I was kind of excited to get to like have my own little reference to that. And I did look at that illustration before I actually started this. As I finish up drawing this car, I want to tell you a little bit about like why there is a main character in this book. So my main character is Simone, named dually after Simone Biles and Simone Manuel from the Olympics, who both of who are just incredible athletes. And I was working on the manuscript for this book, and I kept coming into the fact that while it is narrative nonfiction and you don't necessarily need like a narrator, I wanted a visual narrator, someone who would walk you through the process of this book and be like a proxy for you as a kid reading this. I tried many different drafts without that, and I felt that there was this connection to you as a human that was sort of missing. And that's actually the whole like reason I got into making these books, is I wanted to figure out how to explain to you as a person why sharks were important and how them disappearing would affect your life. Like you being this like person who's taking in this content. And that was something I thought about when I made my infographics. It's something I thought about when I made my short film. And when I came to making the book, different from the infographics and the short film, I realized that you needed this like proxy for you as a human in the story, that the books really needed that. And that was a suggestion from my editor. Before she had bought the book, that was something she had said to me, as she felt like it needed a visual narrator. I did not come up with that idea. Like that was something that she suggested, and I had to like take that information and kind of play with it to make it work for me. I don't feel like I needed that in my short film, but short films are a different medium than picture books. So I came up with Simone, who I wanted to be this little character who takes you through the books. In If Sharks Disappeared, her parents are in the books with you. And the cool thing about that is you're watching her like experience this world with two adults, and it feels very safe. Now, when I had her travel, I didn't want to have like all these different people in the books. It was too visually busy, especially because she as a character is never named. She never shares her point of view. She really is just like that proxy for you to feel like you're in this world. So I decided what I was going to do is in each place that she is, I would always have an adult so that it felt like there was someone monitoring the safety of each of these ecosystems, especially because I'm like in this book, we're like chasing tigers. Like you should not do this. So I need to have an adult who's like a professional in this environment, and then another kid. So there's someone local to each place that gets to take you through it and is like either in this case indigenous to the place that we are, or is a visual representation of who might live in this place. it's a nod to the people who live in these areas, especially in a book like this one and in a book like If Polar Bears Disappeared, where I do have Indigenous people who are taking you through the book. And there are people who can show Simone their world. So they're introducing you as the reader and you to Simone, to this world, and inviting you in, making you feel welcome. So in that sense, like, this is what these characters are. This book is truly about tigers. The characters are never named. I don't think they're even really referenced at any point in the text. And that's one of those things where it's like, as the author and the illustrator, I got to make this decision that I got to tell like two different stories almost. Like, they're the same story, but I got to make two very different decisions. I do not reference the characters in the text. The text is strictly about tigers and the ecosystem they're in. And if you read that alone typed out onto the page, you would never know that there was a visual narrator. You would never know that you follow these characters following the animals. But these characters do a really good job of allowing you to get into the story. Still working on this truck, which is so funny because for someone who really doesn't like working on trucks, I'm really perfecting all the little details on this truck, but I just want to make sure it looks relatively correct, knowing that I will have some amount of error on it. If someone who's really like a car person looks at it, I know that they're going to see error, but I can't really worry about that too much because that's the type of stuff that I will think about as I'm working on this, and it'll just make me work slower and it'll make me get more in my head. And something I have to really focus on when working on any project, but specifically my books, is trying to please me first. Me as the creator of them first, making sure they're what I want to say, making sure they're what I want it to look like, and of course making sure that they are scientifically accurate. I work with many different scientists and experts throughout working on these books. I work with usually at least one, if not like three different scientific experts who fact check my books. I do all the research. I take in all the information I can to learn about the complex different animals I'm talking about, the ecosystems they live in. I read scientific journals, I read dissertations, I read picture books, I read other types of nonfiction books, I watch documentaries. I take in a ton of different information. I narrow it down as to what I know will help serve the narrative, right? It's a narrative nonfiction. So there's some amount at which I don't really need to know like how much a tiger eats, because I take that information in and then I'm able to realize like that is not something I'm going to include in the text, right? It was something I included in the text for If Elephants Disappeared because elephants are so big and they walk so much, and their poop is actually what the entire book is about. And I have to say, when If Sharks Disappeared came out, there was a book that was at a bookstore next to my book at one point. I went into a bookstore to sign some copies, and next to If Sharks Disappeared was an entire book all about poop. And I literally said to myself, I'm never going to write a book about poop. And you know what they say about the word never? Never say never, because I did all the research for If Elephants Disappeared, fully expecting to make a book about African savanna elephants. That was my intention. I wanted to try to get as many different continents as I could into this book series, like North America, Europe, in the sense that If Bees Disappeared is going to be in Europe, and then Asia for If Tigers Disappeared, and Africa for If Elephants Disappeared. And doing that research, I realized that there wasn't enough information about the ecosystems of African savanna elephants that I needed. And at this point, I had already decided I was going to do If Tigers Disappeared, and I knew that I was going to set that one in India. And so I was like, I don't want to do one about Asian elephants because I'm going to be talking about the same forests that I'm going to be talking about in If Tigers Disappeared. So I had to like really figure out what I was sifting through. And If Elephants Disappeared ended up coming together incredibly well, for the fact that during the research phase of that book, I had to really figure out what I wanted to talk about. So I did a ton of research on African savanna elephants. I kind of was like grasping at straws, realizing that there wasn't enough information for me to make this book the way I wanted to make it. And so I started doing more research on just broadly like the continent of Africa. And that was when I learned that there was actually African forest elephants, which I had never heard of before. And this is a very roundabout way to say, when I was doing research into African forest elephants, which is where I kind of pivoted to doing some like light research on that. And then I realized that there was a lot of documentation. Okay, I should not say a lot. There was an incredibly well done research paper and then some other supporting papers on the fact that African forest elephants were integral to their ecosystems due to their poop, due to the dung that African elephants like digest and poop out. And that entire book became a book about dung. And I was like, I am never going to do this. And then I ended up having to do that because that was where the science took me. And this is all to say that these books are really dictated by the science. I do a lot of research into what I know I will probably need, and then I often have to like pivot into what I don't know I need. But I am taking in all this research, I'm doing all this research, I find the through line, I usually do a draft or two, and then before I even send it to my editor, I usually will start to reach out to specialists in the field and get their feedback on my work. And they will read through my work, tell me where and if I could push something, where and if I could make something more clear, or where and if maybe I have misstepped. And I make sure that the scientists approve what I'm talking about. I'm not a scientist. Again, it's really important to get feedback on this. Similarly, I also got feedback I usually get feedback on my character designs. I make sure that my character designs are, to the best of my abilities, sensitive and grounded in reality. I consult multiple different people on that, usually people from the place that I'm set the book in, people who work with the people that the book is set in. For this book, I had 3 different experts give feedback on the character designs, including sensitivity readers, and those were actually other people, not including the 3 different experts. And If Polar Bears Disappeared, I had many different conversations with a wonderful Inuk woman who gave me a lot of feedback on my character designs, making sure they were as sensitive as possible to the indigenous people that live in this area and deal with these issues much more directly than I deal with, in a different country. So there are all these different experts who give me feedback, and I do my best job to get as much research as possible to make sure that my books are scientifically grounded. The cool thing about narrative nonfiction is I'm not presenting all the facts, right? I don't need to tell you like tigers eat X amount of pounds of food a day and drink X amount of water. That's not what my book's about. My book is about like tigers interact with their ecosystem this way, and then those things that they interact with other things this way. It's a cause and effect book. So really I'm looking at this chain events, this series of reciprocal events, and figuring out how those events all then affect other things. So I'm not just researching tigers, I'm researching the ecosystems, I'm researching the plants, I'm researching the other animals that live there, I'm researching the people that live there and how the government interacts with those people. And it's this like really layered series of research that I'm doing. So like my experts are not always necessarily exactly like a tiger scientist. There are other types of people too. And that's actually how some of my character designs come about. Is I do, like I was saying earlier, I always have a adult in the places that Simone is exploring with another kid. And I make sure that that adult has a whole variety of different jobs. Designing these different characters is really cool because I get to include many different things. I get to include scientists. I get to include, this one's a conservation photographer. I also include like master gardeners and If Bees Disappeared. And so the adults are all different. I also make sure that they like look different. They look like a person who might have this job in this area. I try to make it look like they are someone who would live in this area, not just someone who's like a transplant or, for instance, a white person who is like in this area doing science, because sometimes scientists who come in from other countries are at odds with some of the conservation work that's happening there. I know that sounds weird, but that is what I have found to be true across several different books. So there's a lot of different nuance I'm thinking about when I make these character designs. I'm not just necessarily being like, okay, what would an adult look like? I'm thinking about like all these different things. And then on top of all of those things, I also actually make sure that every single adult that I have included has a different body type, and is a different age. I did not just want to include a 20 to 30-year-old female. I did not just want to include someone who is like straight sized. So all of my people look different. They are all different ages. They are all different weights. And these are kind of just like all the things that go into this. Like you would never even know this again, because my character designs and my characters aren't even in the text. It's just like an extra thing that I'm thinking about as the illustrator. And that's why like illustrators, I will say, just like my little preachy moment on my soapbox, do not get nearly enough credit for the work that they do. It is so common that I will be at a reading and someone will only mention the author's name versus mentioning the illustrator's name. And illustrators are half, if not more, of a picture book. An illustrator is coming up with a visual storyline for you to follow and all of the intricacies that go into that visual storyline. The writer is coming up with the storyline and all the intricacies that go into the text, but the illustrator is coming up with the intricacies that go into the visuals. And that is really important. That is what grabs in a reader. That is what excites a kid when they're looking at a book. So all of these things are like many different layers of what I am thinking about. That was an excellent tangent, if I do say so myself, but getting back to what I'm actually drawing, instead of just like talking about how I'm drawing it, I am doing the same thing I actually did with the background and the same thing I did with the car. I'm flatting in the basic color, like the solid color that I mostly need to work on, making sure that I do the outline with the brush so you get the really nice texture on the outline. And then I am often going in and lasso tooling the full fill and then like paint bucketing the full fill in. So I'm getting that flat color, and then like making sure I get like right here, I'm doing just a brush with making sure I'm getting little hands on there. So I'm flatting in the color, and then what I do is I take that rougher brush, the flatting in the color and doing the outline are always done with the tighter brush. And then I take that rougher brush and I will go in and add like some amount of value difference to like the hair, the cheeks, the nose, a little shine on the forehead wherever I need it, or a value difference to the shirt, the clothing, making sure that like the arm stands out from the body. Those are the types of things I will put in with the rough brush so that there's a really nice texture that feels like it loops back and brings you back to the background. Same textures too. So all those similar textures will allow you to feel like this is one harmonious style. And I am right now putting in the little girl in the front of Simone, and now that I have got her flatted in, I am going to start adding the detail. I can add the nose, I can add the eyes, I can add the curls in the hair, I can add the mouth and the teeth and the details on the hands. As I've added the flat, so I know where everything is. I have my rough sketch underneath, so I know where things belong, and then I can go in and add the detail with the finer, tighter brush. Something I also do is I color drop from my reference image. I made these character designs. I really like the colors I chose. I said earlier, but I don't really like do a ton of like super intense lighting on my characters in these books. I sometimes add like some amount of shadow or some amount of highlight if it feels like it needs it, but I'm not adding really dramatic like film noir shadows to my characters. I'm a pretty flat colorist overall. And it was really funny because recently I just was talking to the colorist on my graphic novel. And she even said that. She was like, I was looking at all your artwork and your characters and your colors are overall like pretty flat. So I'm going to kind of roughly stick with how you do that. So stylistically, I do like pretty flat looking art. And also just like I like executing that. So that's like a stylistic decision that I made. So while there are going to be like some amount of highlights, some amount of shadows, some amount of value differences on the clothing, the hair, the cheeks, the face, maybe the nose, the forehead, the lips, there's not going to be like so much that it's really dramatic. So because of that, I am able to work from past drawings that I've done of the characters, other pages where I think that they're in the like similar lighting, or like this where they are in a patch of sun here, so I don't need to worry too much at all about the lighting. It's going to work out really well that I can just take the character design page that I've done and I can just like color drop the colors that I have in there. Out of the 3 characters, the adult is the last one that I have to illustrate. And then I will be at the stage of just adding final details to this entire illustration. Oftentimes, like the characters are the things I really enjoy drawing and I get really excited to draw. I left them to be the last thing to work on in this because I wanted to make sure that I really got the vibe of the background before I approached the central thing that you're focusing on in the artwork. But it would have been easy and fun to have started with the characters. Sometimes I do this though, where I save the thing I want to do until the end, and this way I like have motivation to stick through the entire thing. Not that I wouldn't necessarily, I always would, but I think like pacing this in a way that works for me to consistently like stick with it is also something that you just learn as a trick for being a career professional in something like this, because you're gonna have to illustrate even the spreads that you don't like want to illustrate as much. This one being one that I actually was clearly I wanted to illustrate it because I filmed it. So I leave the characters until the end because I want to get the background and understand kind of like all the vibe that I'm going for, and then also because they're really fun to me. So giving myself a treat at the end is really enjoyable. I am going to go in and like finesse the details at the very end, but I've got to get the characters in there the way I want, like first. So I have plopped in the skin color of the adult, the hair color of the adult. I have erased some of the hair color of the adult because the hair color is over top in terms of layer order of the shirt. So now I'm going in lasso tooling that shirt in the back. Sometimes I do really worry about making sure there's that like live brush edge on some of my stuff, and other times like I don't worry as much. She's not the main focus of this, and her shirt is definitely not the main focus of this, so I can just like lasso tool that in and that works. I am now adding the like camera, and she is going to be photographing an animal up in the tree. So right now, if you're thinking, I wonder what she's photographing, like guess what animal maybe she would be photographing. And so I've got to add the different shadows to that camera. I've got to add some value difference to her shirt. I've got to add the lines that are going to be on top of her clothing, differentiating them, showing the crinkles, and then the people will be done. Character design and costume design are so fun for me. I love envisioning like who's in these different worlds that I create. I like creating characters that feel like authentic to the world that they're in, feel authentic to the story I'm making. It doesn't matter if it's a graphic novel or a picture book. I really enjoy thinking about all the different people who would best reflect the worlds like we know and the worlds that we're in. So getting to like work on the characters is so fun for me, and specifically I really love costume design. Costume design is also like incredibly joyous for me to work on. I love thinking about the narrative quality that I am depicting of the characters in their entire design. I do teach a character and costume design course on the Cuttlefish Academy. If anyone's interested in learning more from me about this, I did character and costume design in feature film animation as well as for TV animation and some like commercials before transitioning to doing it for myself. And doing it for myself was really fun because like I am the utmost authority on what I put in my books, which means I have like a lot of creative control over it. And like I said, I do consult like experts to make sure I'm doing this like as authentically and like honestly as possible. But I really do enjoy the fact that like I am ultimately the person who gets to decide what I'm doing. And so even if a boss has a different opinion on it, I get to be the person who's like, yeah, this is like what I want. This is the way I want. This is where the crinkle on this clothes is going to go. This is the design that's going to be on the shirt. All these little things that I'm thinking about, I get to incorporate. So it's really joyous for me to get to like work on that and get to like see my character designs end up being printed on the page and end up being published and in the hands of kids who read them. It's really fun. I've been doing all of this against a white background. That was so I could see what I'm doing, making sure I'm putting in the proper color everywhere. And then I'm going to turn on this background, and that is going to dramatically change what we're looking at. I almost forgot this whole time I've been narrating this like that. We are on a white background, that I did design the background, but you're not seeing it right now. You're just seeing like the detail layer of the background. Like I was saying, I kind of do like a solids layer where I paint, and then I often do like a detail layer over top where I add like lines or other types of details. That's just like the way I organize my files. I know a lot of people do it differently, but you're here learning from me right now, and that's what I do. So right now you're just seeing like the detail lines so that I can make sure that the camera's pointed at the right spot, because the camera's pointed at a tree. It needs to be pointed at a tree for the illustration I had in mind. And the rest of it like doesn't matter right now. But when I turn on that background layer, that's going to make the characters either pop or blend in. And I'm going to have to look at that and see if I need to add any like shadows or highlights anywhere to make sure that they don't feel too off from what the background is like. I do really like that like matte painting look with the characters on top of it, similar to like animation in that sense, like cell animation, where like the backgrounds are really beautifully painted and the characters look more cartoony on top of that. I do really enjoy that as probably a holdover from my time in animation, but I do still want it to feel like it blends in with the background and doesn't feel like too different. Like I want it to feel like one cohesive illustration, ultimately not actually like an animated cell painting. So I do need to make sure that like everything works together. So when I plop that background color on, I am going to like zoom out and reassess and make sure that it does look the way I want. Added the camera strap, made sure I have some of the details like the earrings and stuff on the characters. Zoom out, check it out, see if there's anything I want to add to the characters before I turn on that background. Turn on that background and analyze. Okay, looking at it, I still have that little gap, which I thought would be covered by the car, but it's not. So I need to fill that in with some dark background for the bushes and the shrubs. And now I'm going back in and making sure it's like really dark to make them pop, but not like so dark that they blend in. I can have some amount of blending. That's like totally fine. They are feeling cohesive with their environment because they do blend in a little bit, but I'm going to finesse that background behind them, make sure it looks like finalized, ready to be finalized. Zoom out, reestablish like what I'm looking at, see if it looks good, analyze, critique, think about what I need. One of the things I'm definitely thinking about right now is that car feels really white and Simone's orange shirt feels like really bright and like it's popping just a touch too much. So I bet you what I was thinking right here is, how do I incorporate some of that in this? How do I incorporate some white? How do I incorporate some orange? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a few little flowers, some roadside flowers, they might even be weeds, but some weeds have flowers. Just get some like little dots of white in there. So it doesn't just feel like there's only greenery. It feels like there's some amount of like plant life that's not just greenery in here. I'm adding some little plants, and then I'm adding them in white and a little bit of orange. So we have that like orange, another orange pop throughout. That's subtle, but also just doesn't make her shirt the only orange thing in this whole thing. It's so subtle, but to me this feels like that's like enough for what I need. Okay, and one final thing really is, what is the photographer taking a photograph of? What do I need to add to that tree? I had a lot of reference of different birds. India has some really incredible like wildlife that I was so excited to get to paint. I love getting to learn about all the different like plants and animals in each of these different places. And while I cannot remember all of them right now off the top of my head because it's been a few years and I have worked on so many of these books, I have like a bunch of reference files for them. And so I know that like at the time I was very excited specifically about this one bird, which I had like saved a bunch of photos of and done a bunch of research on. I'm going to zoom in right now and we are going to put that bird in the tree. That will be another pop of color, but the color that will, I think, not only have a good flow for your eye in this general area of the canvas, but also be like another thing for you to look at in this area. So your eye is flowing because of the way I've shaped the plants and I've shaped the branches. Your eye is going to flow, and the light. Your eye is going to flow to these characters in this car. And then this character, this adult who is a photographer, she is going to then allow you to look up and see this little treat in the greenery, which is this little bird. And I don't necessarily include every single animal in my rough sketches. I often will like include them as I'm finalizing things. Like that's something that I think my like editor knows at this point, is like I will just be like, yeah, I know this scene needs more wildlife, and then I'll just kind of like figure out how to put them in there as I'm working on it. Because like if you are in nature, you don't always see all the animals all the time, right? Like animals do a really good job of concealing themselves to protect themselves. So like I have to like covertly put them. So I will sometimes have a lot of them in the sketch, but I don't think this bird was in this sketch, or at least if it was like a blob. And now I get to just kind of like put it in on this little branch so you can see them there. And they are so cute. They are so cute, and add another little pop of color. Okay, we are at the ending. I'm going to take the title off because eventually that layer doesn't matter. The text will be laid in an InDesign by the publishing house. I'm really in charge of the art, and I'm in charge of what the text says, but not the way necessarily the text looks. Adding in just like a little bit more greenery on the road, and then we are done here. This is my final illustration for the title spread for If Tigers Disappeared. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. I hope you learned something, maybe about children's books, maybe about how children's book art is made, certainly about how my children's book art is made. I really appreciate you spending such a long amount of time with me. And if you would be so inclined, I would love if you could like it, especially if you made it this far. Like this video and subscribe to my channel. If there was anything throughout the video that you had a thought about, or you wanted to know more about, or you felt like I should make an entire video about, a deep dive into anything or a light dive into anything, I will happily do that. And I would love if you could leave a comment so I could know what you're interested in seeing more of. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.